Samuel, with a real focus on two matters really, and that is the belief of Samuel's family that there was a king in Israel, and that was God himself and no other, but also a focus very much on, and this is the exhortation and encouragement I hope that will come out through our studies, that is the influence that we can have on each other for good. And our focus very much will be on the positives in that sense. And so we start with a negative. Find that a little bit bizarre, do you? But we know at the end of the book of Judges, and twice in fact in the book, but right at the very end, of course it paints that rather grim picture, doesn't it? That picture of, there was no king in Israel. And every man did that which was right in his own eyes. And reading that from a negative point of view is absolutely true and right in that regard. And if you go across to Deuteronomy chapter 32, we'll see that this was prophesied, of course, in the fantastic words of Moses in the Song of the Rock in Deuteronomy 32. And we'll look at just a couple of verses there. But in our studies, we want to see that this actually also could be read in a positive way as well. This statement that every person, will include that, did that which was right in their own eyes. But if you're over in Deuteronomy 32, you find in this wonderful song where, it's quite clear that God is the rock, and you've probably got it coloured in there, the number of references that Moses says of God through this chapter. But of course, there is that prophetic aspect here. If you focus on verse 15, and we'll come back to this when reflecting on Eli's legacy, but Jeshurun waxed fat and kicked. And you've probably got in the margin there that this term Jeshurun, which is Moses is using of Israel, it's a title, and it's only used that way 3 times in the Bible, once here, once in the next chapter in the book of Witness, and again over in the prophecy of Isaiah in chapter 44. And it means the upright one. And right from the very beginning, I want us to sort of, start to understand God and the way God sees things and the interaction that he has with the people in this story. And I think it's very, very helpful that God looks down upon us and he knows how weak we are and how we do those things which are wrong. But God sees us for what we could be. And I think that's extremely important for us to understand, because he is appealing to us through the word to rise above the natural things that often bring us down. And it's that appeal which is so warm, so comforting, that God sees us for who we will be through his Son. And so we have here the upright one, verse 15. Jeshurun, sadly, didn't live up to that. He waxed fat and he kicked. Right? So there was the prophetic aspect that Israel as a nation would lose their way from time to time, and they would turn inwards. Their attitude, their motivations and their responses would be inward looking in that sense, and therefore not live up to the calling of the upright one. Now that's a given, okay, just like we know that as human beings we let each other down, let alone God. That's a given. But here in this particular concept that we're considering is the flip side. And that is the calling to which God, our King, has called us to. And that's true of the Judges period, isn't it, really? Because although it was true that it's a litany of failures and difficulties and challenges and oppression due to their sins and transgressions, and where they just lost sight of how to walk before their God, that in the middle of that he raised up judges and other people to inspire us and to see that he's always done that in every generation. So in a positive sense about every person doing that which was right in their own eyes, there were people who God was in their eyes. You know, Caleb and Othniel and Achsah, Ehud, Naomi, Ruth, Boaz, Deborah, Jael, Barak, Gideon, Jephthah and his daughter. And in their life, God was king and he ruled there. And even though some of those people, you know, were judges, they never lost sight of the fact that they were in fact honouring God in that. Now, I'm going to say right from the very beginning in this series of studies here, which commences with the exhortation, that I'm probably going to raise more questions than give answers. Because in the record of you know, Samuel and the judges and Ruth, we have things which I think is helpful if we actually do ask the questions. Like, for instance, right from the beginning, can you go across to Judges chapter 10? And some of these things, you know, I went down, I will confess, for a while there, because I've been looking at this for, you know, 12 months or so, but I went down the rabbit hole of chronology. I do love history, and for about a couple of months I was, you know, trying to piece together, and I came to the conclusion, brothers and sisters, that, you know, and if you want 2 months worth of work, then you can talk to me later over a long time. My wife says, don't give it to them, okay, because you go way over time. But I've come to the conclusion very much that it's sad that we've got the Judges, and then we've got the book of Ruth, and then we've got Samuel, when in fact they go like this. They dovetailed together. Because we know that Samuel was the last of the judges. We know that Ruth and Boaz and Naomi were sort of, you know, tucked in there somewhere, okay? And so I went down the rabbit hole of trying to work this out. Now I'm going to confess from the very beginning, it's very, very difficult, all right? But in Judges chapter 10 and verse 7, we have this very interesting statement. It says, and the anger of Yahweh was hot against Israel, and he sold them into the hands of the Philistines and into the hands of the children of Ammon. Verse 8, and that year they vexed and oppressed the children of Israel 18 years. Then it stops, and of course the flow of the book then goes into the time period of the oppression by the children of Ammon. Did you see in verse 7, it actually said the oppression was in the hands of the Philistines and into the hands of the children of Ammon. So we've just got to put the Philistines on hold for the moment, because the record then focuses on the children of Ammon. So what we're talking about for the people in Israel, we're talking about they were being oppressed on the northeast and they were being oppressed on the southwest. And the focus now, let's talk about, it's very much like a history book, let's now focus and talk about the northeast, the problem that they were having. And that was then addressed, of course, at the end of the 18 years by Jephthah. And God raised up Jephthah to deal with the Ammonites. You go, well, what about the Philistines? Well, before we get to the Philistines, we're talking about the year probably 1152 BC. And if you turn the page to Judges chapter 11, verse 26, you find that this is in fact 300 years since Moses' time. While Israel dwelt in Heshbon and her towns, and Aroer and her towns, and all the cities that be along by the coast of Arnon 300 years. Why therefore did ye not recover them within that time? So we've got some sort of foundation stone here about the time period, and therefore in the scriptures, when it talks about the time of the judges being 400 years, and another one in Acts it talks about 450 years, you've just got to sort of, in this rabbit hole, you've got to try and find out, what was the starting point of those times. So we have the Judges and the book of Judges overlapping a little bit. And I don't want to belabor this point. I hope I don't lose you. But in chapter 11 and 12 of Judges, it's focusing on the children of Ammon. And chapters 13 to 16 focuses on the oppression by the Philistines. All right. Now, we saw in Judges 10 that they were sort of overlapping. So the Ammonites caused trouble for 18 years. The Philistines caused trouble for decades. And so Samson was the one that was raised up to deal with the Philistines. So I hope you can see the book of Judges as dealing, compartmentalising a bit. Ammonites, now we'll talk about the Philistines with Samson. Now, where does the book of Samuel then fit in that? And it would seem, and this might be a little radical to some of you, but it would seem that the year that Jephthah had the victory, or I should say God had the victory through Jephthah, was the year that Hannah prayed for a son. And you can see why I might lean that way, not only from the chronology, but just from what's happening in Israel, that if God is dealing with the Ammonites in the northeast, there were two problems facing the ecclesia where Hannah was. Internally, the ecclesia was in terrible trouble because of Eli's family. And additionally, the Philistines were causing them terrible grief. And so if God has released the pressure from the northeast through Jephthah, then surely Hannah's prayer has as its basis that she was pleading that God might deal with the other two issues. And she saw that through the birth of a deliverer. And that's what motivated her, brothers and sisters. Not only the external pressures of the Philistines, which of course Samuel dealt with throughout his life, but of course a reformation within his ecclesia and her ecclesia. A change of attitude, a refocusing so that they might then see there was a king in Israel, and that was Yahweh their God. So God, at this time in history, brothers and sisters, if I'm right, was working or chose to work through two barren women, Mrs. Manoah, or I should put it, I think, in the correct order, Hannah, and then 12 years later, Mrs. Manoah. And they were, of course, involved with, devoting their life for the preparation of this special child. So it was they that took on the Nazarites. They didn't drink strong drink. They were keeping themselves from corruption. As difficult as that may well be, considering, and we'll get to this when we look at sort of Hannah's life when she came up with Elkanah. So I'm posing questions for you to think about the difficulties that sort of surround this beautiful prayer / song that Hannah expresses, and it was just read for us by Ethan. And it's interesting, isn't it, that these two barren women would bring about deliverance. God intervened in their life and opened the womb because they were participants in God's ways to deliver. And this now comes down to sort of in essence what we're going to be looking at throughout this whole week, God willing. And that is this way we can help others when there's a need. And the way we can have an influence for good on everybody within the ecclesia. And how generations can establish things that are true and honest and right and proper and healthy and spiritual and holy. Things that are godly. So it's interesting, isn't it, that she vowed herself, did Hannah, didn't she? Vowed herself. She dedicated herself in preparation for the prayer that she was going to utter. So if you can go across to 1 Samuel then, in chapter 1. And we read in verses 27 and 28 then. For this child I prayed, and Yahweh hath given me my petition, which I asked of him. Therefore also I have lent him to Yahweh. As long as he liveth, he shall be lent to Yahweh. And he worshipped Yahweh there. Bit clumsy in the, I love the authorised, the King James Version, but sometimes it can get a little clumsy. Okay. Others have said, for this child I prayed, the Lord granted me my request that I asked of him. Therefore I also make him one asked of the Lord all the days that he liveth. He is asked of the Lord. Note here, Samuel had no say over it, isn't it? So here's the promise, and it was on behalf of the children. Is there one parent in the room here, or one grandparent in the room that hasn't actually asked that for their own children and grandchildren? The one great joy is Colin here today, right? And we want that so badly. Doesn't always work out that way, does it? Doesn't always work out that way. But through God's strength, of course, we can have an influence on others. They can become our family. To those who can't have children, there's promise to the barren. But it's in this immediate context. We just read those two last verses of chapter 1. That's the immediate context for the words of Hannah. So this prayer or song that she sang in verses 1 to 10 in chapter 2, it was in the context of her fulfilling her vow, wasn't it? So when she came and gave, the Hebrew word Nathan, to give, when she came up and gave her child to God for all of his life, she then sang this song. And what's the very first verse say? I mean, it's amazing, isn't it? Why is she glad and not sad on this occasion? Have you thought about that? She starts off by saying, my heart rejoiceth in Yahweh. Mine horn is exalted in Yahweh. My mouth is enlarged over mine enemies, because I rejoice in my salvation, thy salvation. And you go, because this woman has got a bigger picture, and she sees God working in her life, and she's so grateful for that. Even though, brothers and sisters, parents, grandparents, she's leaving her little child in the care of Eli. And seems like she only sees him once a year to bring a bigger coat. And yet her heart is bursting with joy. Why? Because she asked God to provide a deliverer. And he granted that appeal, that begging, that prayer. He granted that to her. Because God wanted to work through this family to bring about a massive change in Israel. Did she really fulfill her vow that day? Did she? What was the vow? The vow was to give this child, this young man, this boy, to God, to Yahweh, forever. A little proof, if you want proof, of that statement is that when they came up to give, notice in verse 24 of chapter 1, that in there they don't bring the gift, the sacrifices that equated to the fulfillment of a Nazirite vow. I'm not going to tell you what they are. You can go and read my father-in-law's book on it. So this is different. The vow is not complete. And I think that's true of all of us, isn't it, brothers and sisters, parents and grandparents? The job is never done. The vow is never complete until the day when we will all be exalted in God and immortalized. So we can't put our feet up and say, oh, well, that's it. Parenthood's over. It doesn't happen that way, does it? And so that's why, brothers and sisters, I think in verse 1 here of chapter 2, in this song, the word she uses for rejoicing means to jump for joy. And it's interesting that word, it's reasonably rare in the Bible. It's only got 8 references in the scriptures, and those 8 references all have to do with the victory over God's enemies. It's actually used by David, and that's significant because one of our studies is the influence of Samuel over David. So here's David's... I don't think I turned my little split thing on. Sorry about that. Fortunately, I haven't walked away. So what we've got here is David was influenced greatly by Samuel and by Samuel's parents, I believe, in guiding him in and being king over Israel. And so he actually uses this same word in 1 Chronicles chapter 16 verse 32, if you're taking notes, and Psalm 96 verse 12 is the equivalent in the book of Psalms. And that's in relation to bringing up the ark. Right, this passion that Samuel had of putting God front and centre in Israel was shared by David. And this word about jumping for joy was so appropriate in the time, in the story of David's attitude towards the bringing up of the ark successfully to Jerusalem. In fact, she goes on to talk about how her horn, notice that my horn is exalted in Yahweh. Now, Jamieson, Fawcett and Brown actually tell us that, historically, that at this time, women in the eastern areas and Israel often wore a tin or some sort of metal or tiny silver horn on their forehead. And that it used to be sort of sticking out, all right, if they didn't have children, and then they stuck up. They moved it up when they did have children. So I guess it was an evident token to Hannah all those years, if that was true, that people could see that she was a barren woman. But here the horn is tipped up, it's exalted. Now, whether or not that is true, I don't know. But here, of course, even if it's it's beautiful, the whole metaphoric, isn't it? Because the horn, we know, gives praise to God. It's also used of power. In both of this, it's God's salvation. God was working in this woman, and she exalted, she gave that kind of praise to God. It's something that we need to do constantly, isn't it? To reflect upon what God has done for us. And then that triggers, or ought to, a response. And that response, of course, is to praise God and to help others and to look out how we can be of service to Him because of the great things that God has done for us. It's interesting, isn't it, that of course this is picked up in the book of Luke in chapter 1 and verse 69, where it says, He hath raised up an horn of salvation for us in the house of His servant David. So once again, we've got there those, the women, Elizabeth and then of course Mary, both of course understanding this, that God hears prayers, that God acts and saves. And we're here in this room today And we can say amen to that. That God guides, interrupts lives, brings about an understanding of what his purpose is, and saves through his Son, through his anointed. And so what's the flow then from that? Well, there's this declaration of praise there in verse 2 of Hannah. There is none holy as Yahweh. For there is none beside thee, neither is there any rock like our God. You look at that, and each phrase of this beautiful prayer or song here, all the way through, is highlighting this, the holiness of God. And just pause, and this is one of the things I want us to do. And I'll ask the question, where was she when these words were expressed? Where was she? And was that place a place of holiness? Think about the early chapters of Samuel. Think about Eli and his family and the tabernacle at that time and what was going on. Was that a place of holiness? Was that a place where God reigned? And then I'll counter that, brothers and sisters, and say, yeah, although that environment was totally corrupt and ungodly, an unholy place, it's true to say here, because individually and personally and within that family, Elkanah and Hannah understood and lived the holiness of God. So it can be said there of that, because in their life, as for me and my house, said Joshua, and it was the same here of these faithful brothers and sisters. And I guess the exhortation that comes out there quite clearly, doesn't it? Think about it. Is our desire to worship God in the beauty of holiness, is that really dependent on our environment? We can be grateful when the environment is helpful. And I thank God every day for the family that I grew up in, and the extended family, which I will honestly say includes the Enfield ecclesia, although I haven't seen you much over the many years living in Sydney, but I embraced you because you were Val's family. So I gained great benefit and very grateful to God for that. So yes, it should be right for us to appreciate and express our thankfulness for that. But what if the environment within the family, or within the ecclesia, or the young people's group, is not so helpful? Well, it's the attitude of Hannah, isn't it? It then comes back to personally desiring that God might dwell in our hearts and direct our feet in walking in his ways. And notice what she also says, there's no other God, there's none beside thee. It's beautiful the way scriptures sort of pick up this. And you sort of think of Hannah's prayer here, and currently I'm looking in Isaiah, a study that's been going a long time, but this Isaiah, God through Isaiah is actually quoting her here. In fact, hold your hand in, Sam, if you can go across and I'll show it to you, because she says there's none beside thee, neither is there any rock like unto our God. And of course, you immediately go, well, she's citing Moses. She's quoting the Song of the Rock in Deuteronomy 32, and that's true, but look at what Isaiah does. My father-in-law always used to say, if you want the gospel of God in 3 books, then you understand Deuteronomy, Isaiah, and Romans. And he's not wrong. Isaiah 44, look at verse, we'll read 6 to 8. It says, thus saith Yahweh the King of Israel. Sorry, I'll pause. I mustn't have said 44. Isaiah 44, verses 6 to 8. Thus saith Yahweh the King of Israel, and his Redeemer, Yahweh of hosts, I am the first, and I am the last, and beside me there is no God. Keep on reading. And who, as I, shall call and shall declare it and set it in order for me, since I appointed the ancient people, and the things that are coming and shall come, let them show unto them. Fear ye not, neither be afraid. Have I not told thee from that time, and have declared it? Ye are even my witnesses. Is there a God beside me? Yea, there is no God, I know not any. And the last word God there, if you haven't got it in your margin, you might like to write it in, is not the usual word El or Elohim. It's actually the word Zer, T-Z-U-R. It's the one that's translated rock. So this is an unusual translation. So here we've got God through Isaiah quoting Hannah. I just, school of prophets, I said to the boys, you know, one thing you got to ask, right? You can say it? Okay. So what? So what? So that's a lovely point. You go, so what? The so what point is the harmony between, you know, the people of God and God himself. That God is actually quoting Hannah in this regard is just beautiful to see how in sync she was with what God was trying to do in her life. And when we put it into the context of what was going on around her, I just think that is so amazingly powerful. So she continues in verse 3, talk no more so exceeding proudly, let not arrogancy come out of your mouth, for Yahweh is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. Again, that's an interesting, when you get into a word study here, the word knowledge there, that he's a God of knowledge, is only used 6 times in the scriptures, and every time it's used of teaching babies. So just think of that in the context. She's given just up her baby, as it were, to Eli. She's going to leave him behind, knowing full well that God was going to educate him, just like she had already educated him, and that whenever she visited, she would further educate him. But she placed this young boy into the hands of God. And I think, brothers and sisters and parents and grandparents, I keep on appealing, I think that's what we've got to realise, that that's really what we're doing, isn't it? Okay? We'd love to coddle and make every decision in their life, but the fact is we can't. In fact, it's not even healthy in that sense. And we've got to learn that God is in control, and that we give our children and our grandchildren up to him. And she did that so beautifully, didn't she? And by him, actions are weighed. You know, God is fair, brothers and sisters. We know from Romans chapter 11, you know, the goodness and severity of God. You know, he is fair in everything that he does. And so Hannah is, you know, recognizing that God is real in her life. He's at work in our community. In her life, she could feel it, she saw it, even in that kind of environment, and yet here he is, and she's acknowledging that everything he does is right and appropriate. And so in the next 4 or so verses here, we've got the reversals. It's something Uncle David said just a little bit earlier in, you know, at the door before the series of studies, and we're just talking about how that this whole story is about reversals. See, Hannah and Elkanah and Samuel wanted to take Israel from here to here. They had to reverse things, didn't they? In the mindset of people and their behaviour that came out of their understanding that God worked in their life. okay? The moral implications. They wanted to change this. And so all the way through here, we have this particular, the reversals of things, because to quote Paul in Acts chapter 17, the gospel message turned the world upside down. And the things which are natural in our world are the opposite of the supernatural, the opposite of what God wants. So yes, I'm an educator, and yes, I had to do educational philosophy. And sometimes they had some good ideas when they were consistent with the scriptures. But the thing I learnt was that you had to judge that, didn't you? You have to work out what God really wants, and then occasionally humans get it, right. And so all the way through here, notice this, the bows of the mighty, so the warriors are weakened. Just looking at the end of verse 4 there, stumblers are strengthened. It's the opposite, isn't it? Warriors are supposed to be strong. But God works through Samuel and Hannah. He worked through Jephthah and his daughter. All of these, that's what judges were supposed to teach us, wasn't it? That God will make strong. God will be seen. The strength of anything that's seen is God's work. In fact, the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians in chapter 12 picks that up, doesn't he? The penny dropped and he sort of said, when I'm weakest, that's when God's strength is seen and it's made perfect. It's developed and shines so that God shines in us. And it's not us doing that. It's God shining. And so all the way through here, the hungry are full. The barren has children. In fact, the mother that has lots of children has no support. This is what she's saying in this, because God is changing things. He sees things differently. Even verse 6, which seems too much, Yahweh killeth and maketh alive. Well, we know that's true, doesn't it? That God is king. He makes decisions, and those decisions are right and appropriate. In fact, there for those who are taking notes, she's actually citing again Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 39. And this whole concept of this reversals, brothers and sisters, is picked up and is a major theme in the book of Isaiah. We've already considered chapter 44, there is none God. All the way through there, God is king, and that's the message that Isaiah was trying to get through to them when they went into the captivity from chapters 40 through to 66. And here, this was the thought process of Hannah. So God only is the king. Verse 8, he raiseth up the poor out of the dust. He lifted up the beggar from the dunghill to set them among princes. Look what he's doing to make them inherit the throne of glory. And by the way, that's what Tim said to you, Colin, in welcoming you in. He said, I hope that your walk is short. Now, he wasn't talking about sort of a sudden demise there. He's talking about the coming of our Lord, wasn't he? I hope that's what you were meaning, Tim. Yeah. Okay. So what we've got here, of course, is the exaltation process. And sure, life is full of tragic events, and life is full of sadnesses and challenges. But as it's expressed in the book of Acts, isn't it? All of that is actually beneficial. As the Proverbs say, you learn more in the house of mourning than the house of praise and partying. So what we've got here is her understanding that God will exalt those who humble themselves. And what an exaltation! For the pillars of the earth are Yahweh's, and he hath set the world upon them. Verse 9, he will keep the feet of his saints, and the wicked shall be silent in darkness, for by strength shall no man prevail. And a lot of you, of course, have probably already gone across to Luke chapter 1, verses 49 to 53. We won't go there for time. But of course, Mary picks this up, doesn't it? Mary actually, frames the whole of her response to God in regard to the birth of her deliverer, the Messiah, that she frames all this in the words and concepts of Hannah. There's direct quotation, of course, there of several things, and her own thought process upon those words. And whilst you're taking notes, Psalm 113 verses 5 to 9 is also, I wonder whether it actually was written by Hannah or somebody actually reflecting on Hannah's, but we don't have time to go there. So we find ourselves, I'm hoping, because Tim sort of said, the word of exhortation was to enthuse us today. I hope that we've sort of been caught up in this, the mind of Hannah. She sees through the current spiritual malaise, the moral corruption, and we'll do more with this in our second study this evening, so we're falling back into a little bit more introduction, and the political leadership failures of her time, to see God's anointed surrounded by his redeemed saints. Brothers and sisters, today is meant to exalt ourselves. It's meant to show you and to express to you that that is what God desires. He has not called us this day to find fault. He's called us to remind us of what he has done for us through his Son, his anointed. But also to remind us that that work is in and through us. That we are those redeemed saints. And I remember a couple of decades ago now, we were talking to a couple, interested friends, and the husband had sort of background in religion. The wife was a bit of a blank slate. She told me she was Catholic, so she didn't have any religion. And when talking to him, he, after about 10 or 11 months of chats and visiting, and they went so met members of the ecclesia, he made this comment, brothers and sisters, and I say this as a little challenge to our community. He said, in all the time that I've been hanging around the Christadelphians, he said, I've never ever ever heard you refer to each other as saints. Had a big impact on me, because I thought, yes, we don't want, brothers and sisters, to come here today to concentrate on the failures. That's a given. We let down God and others. But we've come here to be exalted because God sees us for who he wants us to be and who we will be. And therefore, in our life today, he sees that. We sometimes can't see the glimmer of that. We're all crusty, aren't we? And we don't shine so much. But God sees through that. And Hannah expresses that here, brothers and sisters. We're here today because we've been redeemed by the blood of the Lamb, our King. And so she says there in verse 9, God will keep, that's the word to hedge about, to guard, it's the one that's famously in Proverbs 3 and 4, the feet of his saints. That is God's desire, to save us. Now, she may well be referring back to Deuteronomy 33, verse 2 and 3, if you're taking notes there. And she goes on to talk about that those who turn their back on that, well, God, of course, in his beautiful character, will deal with those who are the wicked and remain so. It's not talking about sinners, it's talking about those in verse 10 who are the adversaries. And he will deal with that. He will thunder upon them. You sort of think, well, it wasn't so much long ago in history that Deborah and was delivered, the time of Deborah and Barak, that they were delivered by the thundering and the rain from God in judgment upon the oppressors. All right? But it's also, if we want to go forward, God did it again in the life of Samuel, her son, in chapter 7 and verse 10. Where Samuel required a witness from God, and God came down and saved Israel at that time from the Philistines, that other oppressor that Hannah prayed for deliverance from. So ultimately God answered, didn't he, her heart's desire. She was provided a son, a deliverer, a faithful priest, as it says in chapter 2 verse 23, who walked after God's anointed and would walk always before the anointed and forever. She got an intercessor for the people who would reform them, who would judge them. A Nazarite in heart, even though nothing's said about the actual Nazarite vow in Samuel's life, but a Nazarite in heart indeed. And it will be our privilege, brothers and sisters, to spend time through this week perusing lessons. But today, of course, we're drawn here to focus upon the King whom God, his Father, strengthened to overcome, to be the captain of our salvation. And he has been exalted, hasn't he? The horn of his anointed. All we can do today, brothers and sisters, is to respond to what God has done through his Son. That response is full of gratitude, hearts bursting with joy, isn't it? Just like Hannah. And then we share the tokens of that loving sacrifice.